For those of you that don't know, this is my son Arthur, and I'm doing my best to raise Arthur as a Sacramento Kings fan. But Arthur, sometimes we can't put our fandom aside. Sometimes we look at things through purple-colored glasses. So it's good to have an outside opinion of someone who can be brutally honest about our team from time to time. And that's what we have on today's show. Josh Lloyd from the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. He calls it like he sees it, and he joins me right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all off-season long. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports reporter and producer from ABC 10 News, and they say you should never cover the team that you root for professionally. Well, here I am doing it. I absolutely love it, but you know me. I wear my fandom on my sleeve, and sometimes I can't help but look at things through the lens of a Sacramento Kings fan. So that's why I thought it would be a great idea to have Josh Lloyd from the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast join me today. If you're not familiar with him and the work that he does an incredible job covering the entire NBA, not just from a fantasy basketball standpoint, but really from like a national standpoint and an overview. Now, Josh is joining me from Australia, where he is from. So video listeners, you may notice that his picture, his video freezes from time to time, but the audio is really solid, so it shouldn't have too much of an effect. I'm very excited for you to listen to this conversation. Be nice to Josh. I told him to come in here and bring kind of his strong takes, his strong concerns about the Kings, as well as his positives about this Kings team. So I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. I have a pair of purple glasses here, which is fitting because sometimes I can't help but look at the Sacramento Kings through purple lenses. So it's good every once in a while to get an outside opinion. That's why I've brought in someone who I totally respect, someone who should be on your radar if he isn't already. Josh Lloyd, the host of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast. Josh does a phenomenal job covering the entirety of the NBA, looking at players and looking at teams for what they are, whether it's statistically or eye test. He just lays it out there and doesn't really have too many attachments in any kind of area. So when Josh talks about the Sacramento Kings, he's going to be straight. He's going to be brutally honest about what he thinks, good and bad. So I thought, why not have Josh on to both rip apart the Kings in some ways, but also maybe build them up in other ways that maybe we're not thinking about. So Josh, hope everything's going well with you over in Australia, my friend. Welcome in. We're almost to the regular season, maybe, kind of, not really.
We're getting there. We're, 2.5 months away. The regular season's pushed back a week this season, which is a little bit annoying, but that's fine. We'll get there eventually, Matt. And I already have two fan bases that just think I hate them. Whatever I say, Detroit and Toronto think that I'm totally against them and hate them at every turn. So if we add a third to that list, we'll I can wear it. I can take another one on. But I am gonna be honest. I'm gonna bring it here without any attachment to the Kings. Like, I don't have fandom attachment, and I've been really digging into this. Like, fandom is a wild thing with the way that people view things through their own lens, and I'm guilty of it too with the teams that I'm a fan of. But I'm gonna try and do it as objectively as I can here.
Well, let's get it out of the way. Let's rip off the Band-Aid right away, Josh. When you look at this team and this upcoming 2023-24 season, the Sacramento Kings are trying to build upon the year that they had last year. They've mentioned like being a 50-win team is ideal, a team to open a championship window, not necessarily be in the championship contention next year, but they're trying to put themselves on that path and build off of what they did well last season. When you look at this Kings team, being brutally honest, like, what about this team either concerns you or makes you say, you know what, I ain't buying it?
All right, there are a couple of things with this team that I've been concerned about. And I've had back and forward, not even arguments, but discussions with you about this stuff online in the past. Is that part of my issue with the big central thing around the Kings the last couple of years, the Sabonis-Halliburton trade, is, yes, Sabonis will make them better in the short term, but when it gets to the playoffs, where does it go? And that's basically exactly what happened. Like, yes, he had some injuries and all that sort of stuff, but we saw the limitations of that through the playoffs last season. Is that when that change in game style happens, is that I don't think that takes you anywhere that you want to be. And part of the goal of that, it was getting to the playoffs. Mission accomplished. Fantastic. Great for you. Great for all the Kings fans that you guys got to the playoffs. That goal was accomplished. But where does it go from here? And while we look at where this team currently sits, they were, luck. They were the luckiest team last season in terms of injuries. Nobody missed time. Sabonis hurt his thumb and he missed like one game, and people were still saying, he's playing injured 6 months later. I don't necessarily think that's true, but no one got hurt. All of their starters played, and it was by far the fewest man games missed to injury. And that's just not something that you can control. You can't be tough to play through a broken leg or a torn hamstring. If it happens, it happens, right? That just happens. It's luck. There are bits and pieces on the margins you can change, but getting that luck again with injury is almost not going to happen. So that's the number one thing. And one of the other big things that took that big step forward was De'Aaron Fox clutch shooting, but also the fact that he was able to finish at the rim at a level that was honestly we've never seen before. And is that able to continue? Because if that drops off and then you start to get more injuries, then I think there's more of a chance of this Kings team, given that it's basically the same team, is worse than last season versus taking steps forward to a conference finals. I think it's more likely they are worse than they were last season based on those factors.
Let's talk about the Sabonis thing a little bit. And it's fresh in everybody's mind a little bit here in Sacramento because Bleacher Report just released an article calling Sabonis the most overrated player in the NBA, which I adamantly disagree with.
I disagree with that as well.
Okay, well, at least we're on the same page there. But a lot of people do agree, even if they disagree with that, about his limitations in the playoffs and how, even with the purple glasses, I can say that Kevon Looney absolutely outplayed Domantas Sabonis in the playoffs, and I don't think that's debatable. I don't think that can happen if the Kings obviously want to get to where they're going. But my question is, and what I'm curious is, I'm very anxious to see what the Kings and Warriors look like the first time they meet in the regular season again. Now, regular season game one between these two teams, I don't know how much that'll compare to a 7-game playoff series, but the Warriors are going to try and do the same thing to Sabonis, and let's see how Sabonis answers to that. But also other teams are going to try and now do the same thing to Sabonis. My question is, how many other teams can do to Sabonis what the Warriors were able to do so effectively? I thought matchup wise, I was dead wrong. I went into that series thinking that the Warriors weren't going to have any answer for Sabonis and Sabonis was going to dominate that matchup. Turns out the Warriors were very well equipped to take Sabonis out of that dribble handoff game and force him to shoot those mid-range jumpers because of Kevon Looney and Draymond Green and the personnel that they had. So are you worried about the limitations of Sabonis in general, or do you think specific teams are just better suited to take him away?
I think in nearly every case, there's going to be certain teams that are better at that. But my overall thing with the limitations of Sabonis as your best player, which was he your best player last season or Fox? I don't know. It's pretty close, regardless of what it was. It probably is Sabonis, third team All NBA player. The limitations aren't necessarily the things that concern me. They're not necessarily matchup specific. Yes, the way that they were able to take that stuff away. But my problem is having a center who struggles if you have to switch him onto the perimeter, but also can't protect the rim. Well, that's where you run into some real issues, I think, is that you're sort of stuck in no man's land. Like can't play as a 4, really. We saw that in Indiana. That didn't really work next to a shot blocking rim protector like Miles Turner because he gets lost out there. If you play him at the 5, then you've got no rim protection. And that's the thing that I just can't get over in terms of how does he elevate you to that next level. Now, if he is your team's third best player and you've got the ability to, at times when you're running into that problem, take him out of a game because of the defensive limitations, but you've got other guys offensively who can step up and take that load, then that's totally fine. But when he's running as your first or second best player and there's that huge deficiency, and again, it doesn't really matter who you're playing against, but if you can't protect the rim, then in the playoffs, that gets to a real problem because teams can just attack, and that opens up kickouts and all that sort of stuff. And that's always been it's never been an offensive problem. I don't care that he can't really shoot that well. Well, that's fine. He can pass. All that stuff's really good. But if you can't actually do anything defensively and you struggle if you're paired with someone who has to cover up your defensive deficiencies, that leads to a whole bunch of questions that I think really limits the ceiling.
See, defense was something that I thought for sure you were going to come out with, but less about Domantas specifically and more for the team in general, because that is the absolute blatant biggest weakness of this team. And this team is built to be successful offensively. The question marks are, how good can this Kings team develop into just a decent team defense? And now defensively, their metrics and their numbers were actually really good in the playoffs. Some people think that's because of the physicality they were allowed to play with, or the less frequency of whistles in playoff basketball that we tend to see, kind of officials taking a step back a little bit and just letting players play. I hope that's not the case in many cases, because if you're reliant upon that, then maybe you're worried too much about officials and less about like your own personnel. But when it comes to the injury luck, which is something that again is undeniable, and I think like it wasn't just that the Kings were the luckiest team in the NBA in terms of injury luck. It was that by far they were like the second and third teams. It wasn't even close. So I absolutely see that. And I recognize that too. My question is though, I think it's fair to expect that the Kings are not going to be as lucky this season, right? I think it's fair to expect at some point, maybe Fox is going to miss more time. Sabonis is going to miss more time. 2 or 3 key players might miss more time. And then you look at the depth at that point to overcome things. But one of the things I'm looking at to kind of balance out the injury luck is this team now having experience together, what they were able to do in a 9-10 month period compared to now this is their second training camp together. They have playoff experience together. They're battle tested. The core for the most part is the same. When you look at that, do you think that is an advantage in any kind of way, or that's just to be expected?
Well, there's if you're going to say one thing about their off season is that they stayed the same. Like this is the same team, and continuity is important. But they're banking a ton on internal improvement, and I've got criticisms of some of the way they handled their off season as well. But I do think continuity is a positive thing. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. Does it fix some of the holes, or does it offset if you do lose 20 games of Fox, or let's say you lose 20 games of Keegan Murray or sort of Sabonis, like and you're running Trey Lyles and Alex Len out there as your starting center. Like, does that continuity matter in that scenario? I don't think so. I don't think it makes up for that sort of discrepancy. But that is what they're banking on, is continuity and internal improvement, and those things will probably all happen. But as I outlined earlier, like there might be internal regression also. Like Fox might not be a 75% rim finisher. Maybe he's at 68, which is still really good, but maybe he's not the league leader in clutch field goal percentage. Maybe he's 10th, which is still really good, but it's all these little bits that chip off at the margins. And one of the things I preach when talking fantasy basketball is when someone is absolutely outlier level, they are so far ahead of everyone else, like games played or games missed due to injury or rim finishing or clutch field goal percentage, the likelihood of it continuing at that exact same level the next season is so small. And you might go from 1st to 8th in all of those things. And that accounts for 4-5 wins, like just there, we're still being good, but not being, wow, we haven't seen that number in 10 years sort of thing.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Ibotta. It is summertime, which means barbecues. And if you're picking up burgers and hot dogs for that summer barbecue, we already know you're doing it, so why not get cash back for doing it? You can do so with Ibotta. Ibotta gives you cash back on hundreds of grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you are purchasing. Either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after the shop or after you shop, and you can get your cash back. It's that easy. The average Ibotta user earns $120 per year in free cash back. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, or you could use your cash back to buy that flight that you've been eyeing for some vacation. Other apps give you points that you can use for shops in certain stores, but with Ibotta, you get real cash back that you can use for whatever you want. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 for just trying the app. Use code LOCKED when you register. Go to the App Store or Google Play Store, download the free Ibotta app, and use code LOCKED. That's IBOTTA on the Google Play or App Store, and use code LOCKED. When you said you have criticisms of this offseason, lay some of those out for me a little bit. Like what is it about this offseason that you think the Kings fell short?
I really, on a positive note, bringing in Sasha Vezenkov is big. Like I think he's a really good player. Is he going to be a star in the NBA? Maybe not, but it's really good depth for situations like we saw in the playoffs. The first couple of games of the playoffs, Keegan Murray really struggled, and Harrison Barnes had his struggles through the seasons as well. But now you've got another capable forward. We think he's going to be capable. We haven't seen him in the NBA. Who's bang in the middle of his prime. He's 27 years of age. I think he's a really good player. That's fine. But what I didn't like was them giving away pick 24 in the draft in order to sign nobody. Now, maybe they had plans to bring somebody else in and it fell through, but they just gave that pick away, which is this PTSD for Kings fans. It felt very Stauskas trade, Rondo signing-esque, like we're giving something away and we don't actually know what we're bringing in. And you didn't need to do that. I'm not saying that Olivier Maxence-Prosper was going to be a guy that was going to help this team, or maybe they didn't like him, but I feel like, yes, you cleared that space so they could extend Sabonis, but that doesn't actually help the team this season. And I think Sabonis still could have signed later on in the offseason. But that's just giving away an asset for nothing. And that's my major criticism is they didn't actually bring anybody in apart from Vesnikoff who they had the rights for, and gave away a pick to dump Richaun Holmes to create cap space for what purpose? I don't get it.
Are you willing to reevaluate that come next offseason? Because I think what the Sacramento Kings at least are trying to set themselves up for is now they're going to be going into an offseason next year where hopefully they're building upon another success, but hey, maybe they're trying to retool and reevaluate after this season doesn't go as well. We'll have to wait and see. But they're setting themselves up for now going into an offseason where all 5 of their starters are still under contract for at least the next 2 years. And their main player that whose contract is extending is Malik Monk, who some argue will be a 6th man of the year contender. And we've seen the importance that he has for the Sacramento Kings team. So and maybe you disagree with this or think this is connecting 2 loose ends, but if the Sacramento Kings are in a better position to bring back Malik Monk and maintain that continuity, assuming it's still working next offseason because they were able to use the money that they saved on Richaun Holmes' contract to sign Sabonis this offseason and not have to worry about that next summer. Are you willing to look at it again as a, at best, maybe neutral move, or do you still think it's you gave a pick away for nothing?
I don't have the cap numbers in front of me, but I'm still pretty certain that given the bird rights that they have on Sabonis, whether he was extended now or his cap hold for next offseason, it still would have been the same in terms of cap space. Yes, moving on from Holmes, but I still think there was other ways that could have been done to create that extra space again, which wasn't used this offseason. If that is a plan to bring Malik Monk back next offseason and that works out, and I don't have all those numbers in front of me, so maybe that is a thing, but I still believe that it could have been done a little bit differently. So I don't think that extending Sabonis now actually saves you cap space for next offseason, because he still would have been there with his cap hold at a very similar number, which just counts as a contract, basically puts you over the cap and impacts what you're able to do. So that extra, I get what you're saying. I would change my mind if that was in fact the major part of what they were trying to do, or not change my mind, but it would soften my stance on it. I still think that there are way more creative ways or better ways you could have done it without giving up an asset for no improvement when you're trying to build on what you did this last season.
And the reality is we might not ever know if that was the case or not. It
True.
could be a figure amount that maybe it mattered, maybe it didn't. We don't know. We can just purely speculate. But there was a lot of speculation coming into this offseason about the decision for Harrison Barnes. And I've had to talk some Sacramento Kings fans off a ledge here in Sacramento. They were very disappointed that the move was bringing Harrison back. They don't feel that the Sacramento Kings improved. They thought with what else was happening in the West, the improvement around the West, you look at what the Phoenix Suns are doing, for God's sake, and Kings fans were thinking, man, the Kings needed to do something bigger than bringing back Harrison Barnes. The Kings needed to upgrade that starting lineup, and instead they kept it the exact same. I know you're not a big fan of Harrison Barnes from a fantasy standpoint, because of course, True. He doesn't do much. He just doesn't do much. And I know that conversation with you, but I do view Harrison Barnes as a reliable starter in the NBA. Is he going to bring the Kings over the top? No, I think they're looking for other guys on this roster already to bring them over the top. But when you look at that move and the decision to ultimately bring him back, and you have to take into account the money that they paid for him, the $18 million per year, essentially, compared to the ridiculous contracts that Kyle Kuzma and Jeremy Grant got. You have to take that into account. What do you think of that decision?
I agree with a lot of things that the Kings fans may have said about Harrison Barnes, but you can't afford to let him go. Like you can't afford to, like, it's not an exorbitantly expensive contract. Yeah. Does it tie in and stop you from doing a bunch of other things? No, you still could have done a few different things. And if that was an impediment to bringing in other players, then maybe I discount it. But also, you can't lose a player like that even if he's a starter or a bench player, whatever you want to do on that team, like that's valuable having a player like that. And I think what they would be hoping is that the importance hierarchy of the players switches between Murray and Barnes versus last season, where Murray was like a 5th option most of the time and Barnes was like a 4th, and now Murray moves to a 4th or a 3rd option and Barnes becomes more of the Murray role from last season. And again, having capable forwards who can still defend, no doubt Barnes on the downside of his career, like he's 33, I think he's on the downside of his career, but if he has to transition into a reserve forward in 2 years' time or a year's time, oh well, you can't let that sort of valuable piece, if you are pushing to be a championship contender in 3 or 4 years, having a sixth man of his caliber at age 34, 35 is really, really useful. And yeah, that might be overpaid, but it's not going to be by the time that is. There's no problem with me with him coming back on that contract. My concerns with it is, did it stop you from doing anything else? Because again, you're right, that's not improving the team. It's keeping them the same without adding much on top of it. But as just a thing in isolation, when we're looking at the Barnes contract and how important it is to have a player like that, fine. It's just the fact that you didn't add anything to it is probably more my criticism of it.
Well, naturally, when you look at the team and internally improving, your eyes instantly go to, and mind instantly goes to, the second-year player, Keegan Murray. And I don't know, I'm sure you're aware, Josh, of how over the top of a fan I am of Keegan. Wanted him in Sacramento for a long time. So very excited that he is here. And my belief is, if anybody's going to make the biggest jump next season, it's going to be him, establishing himself as the third option offensively for the Kings, but really their second go-to scorer who can create for himself. And we saw the Kings really lack that in the playoffs, right? When you took the ball out of De'Aaron Fox's hands and tried to run it through anybody else, nobody was really out there that could really create their own shot. Malik Monk had flashes of it, but that's your sixth man. So to me, that's Keegan's role for the taking, or at least the Kings are hopeful. And Monty McNair has even said this in an interview that he did with The Athletic, that the next step for Keegan Murray is to become that guy. How do you feel about putting that much on the plate of I mean, he's already had a lot on his plate as a rookie starting for a playoff team with high expectations, but now going into year two, they're asking him to develop into a go-to scoring option. That's a lot to ask.
It is. And I think that's what they're banking on really happening. Now, I didn't watch Keegan as closely as you did last season. I didn't see every minute of all 82 games and every minute of every playoff second that he was out there, right? I saw a good chunk of what he did. But my concern is that we've seen him at Summer League 2 years, step it up, look really great. But those Kings teams, as I will always point out, had nobody on them. There was just no NBA caliber rotation players on them at all. So he had to do literally everything, and he did. But we also saw last season, and the thing that if I ever criticize Keegan, because I'll be honest, I didn't have him as the fourth player in that draft. I think I had him eighth in that draft. A little bit of an older player, and I was really worried about how it would all work as pushing into a higher option. It's the thing that people will come back at me as well. He set the rookie record for threes, and that's true. He did, because he did play a lot of games, but also he's extraordinarily low usage, and his overall counting stats of production were very low. Now, he played a key part in a playoff team, which is a really important thing for a rookie to do, and he held up. My worry is that, yeah, like you said, how does he go to that third option? Can he actually scale up and be that guy? Because he was never tasked with that responsibility ever last season, and at times, especially even early in the playoffs, like he just disappeared in those early games. And there were times when Mike Brown, if he missed his first three shots, Brown would just bench him and he'd end up playing 20 minutes in the game, because if he didn't hit shots, that's literally all he was there to do. He was never to create for others or to create for himself. It's like, if you don't hit a shot, you're out. We're not playing you. And something has to change it. And I still haven't seen any evidence outside of pure hope that he's going to be able to do that. We hope that he can, and you hope that he can, but I haven't actually seen that evidence that he can do it yet.
Yeah, the evidence that I know I'm attaching to, and I think Kings fans are attaching to, is his two summer league performances in the California Classic. Which, I mean, you look at 29 points and you look at 41 points, and you immediately get excited about that. And like you said, don't necessarily paying attention to the players that he's taking on in those scenarios. But at the same time, it's like an NBA player in the G League. You want to see them dominate to know that they're on another level. So he showed at least he's. Right, like, absolutely.
It's not bad. Like, it might not be good, but it's definitely not bad.
Right. So, I mean, jury's out on a lot of things with the Sacramento Kings. I think there's a lot of, I look at it the same way that I looked at the trade deadline last year. And I don't remember, Josh, ever talking to you about or maybe you didn't even really talk that much or consider what the Kings did at the trade deadline last year that much at all, because they didn't really do anything. Kessler Edwards was the only move that they made. And again, Kings fans were reacting very negatively to this, because they thought with what the Suns getting Kevin Durant, what other teams, like the Kyrie Irving going to the Dallas Mavericks, they're thinking, man, the Kings are going to have a really hard time holding on to this spot. And my belief was always the Kings they're riding the wave. They're riding the high right now. They're just going to stick with what they got and believe that this team can get them there. And lo and behold, that team secures the third seed. Granted, last season it only took 48 wins to do that. I don't know if it's going to take more than that this upcoming season. So when you look at the trade deadline that the Kings had and banking on the team then and them getting really, really hot out of the All-Star break and securing that, does that give you any optimism towards what this team can do together for another season? Or do you think, okay, now teams have had time to figure them out?
I think there's a little bit of that time to figure them out stuff. In terms of the trade deadline last season, I was very skeptical of any sort of playoff success that they had. Like, my expectation was they would get knocked out in the first round. So I thought, I don't think you need to be giving up assets to push. Because that's a real sin that many teams will do. It's like, oh man, look at this, we're playing well. Let's sacrifice and let's rush, let's push. And it doesn't always work out that way when you've got, Fox is 25 and Sabonis is 27. These guys are heading into their primes now. Sabonis is probably right there, but Fox is still heading into it. That you've got 2 to 3 years to see how this all works. You don't need to push to give up stuff to run at this point when I don't really think it's going to work in the playoffs. So I wasn't really critical of what they did there. Again, you get a little bit of success and then you want a little bit more and you want a bit more, which I think a lot of Kings fans might have been feeling at that point with that success they were having. So I've got no problem with that move. Actually, I've really liked them getting Kessler Edwards. I think he can develop into a solid rotation player at some point. But I think there is a little bit of that impatience with, well, we've had a little bit now, why can't it be us? Whereas building slowly, I think, is the correct move in that scenario.
All right, well, Locked On Kings listeners by now know you don't sugarcoat things. So on the positive side, what is it about this team that makes you, maybe a believer is too strong, but makes you feel like they can do this? Last season might not be a fluke.
Well, outside of the things that I mentioned already, like there's no reason to suggest that De'Aaron Fox is going to be terrible. Like, he's good. He's a really good player, and they deserve that discussion as all-stars and all-NBA players. Sabonis, very, very good offensive player. We love watching what he does. Kevin Huerter, underrated player for many years. Keegan Murray was really good as a shooter. My skepticism always is like, is there the next level? How do you get to that absolute peak? And I'm still not going to be convinced of that, but they were fun. They're the most fun team in the NBA. They were the best offense in the NBA. They were the most fun teams to watch, the best atmosphere. That's not going to change. All that stuff's going to continue. You hope for some internal improvement, but another season of that fun with a likely playoff berth coming, whether it leads you further, like for a team that's missed the playoffs for as many years as they have, Matt, like just being a regular playoff team, not even a play-in team, is a huge win for this squad. And doing it while being fun and being exciting and bringing energy every single night. Like, I love that. I tuned in to watch the Kings all the time last season, even if I have doubts about what the absolute peak is of this group. And that's why I would have liked them to try and do something in the offseason instead of dumping picks for nothing at this stage. Like, because I think there's something to add to that level. The fun of what this team is and how good they are and their offensive ability. And there is plenty of room for improvement. So like, that's a huge positive, and teams should embrace that fun. It's not always just about winning a title, because 29 teams don't, and it's that getting there is so hard, and we all want to do it. But just because you don't doesn't mean that it's a failure of a season or a failure of a group or anything like that. So I am excited to see what they can do. I have my doubts that they'll be a 3 seed again, because for the reason you mentioned, that the 3 seed might not need 48 wins, and then there's all that other stuff. But they're just good. They're strong. They're good. Their offense is really solid. They've got a good mix of shooters. They've got a good mix of ball handlers and passers. It's what's not to like about it.
So, Josh, looking at this team as a whole, no sugarcoating, brutal honesty. Like, where do you expect this team to end up when it comes to next season? Like, I think the ESPN NBA preseason power rankings had the Kings as the 12th best team, which is top 12. You would think is not playing, but they had them as the 7th best team in the West. So they think the Kings are right around that playing range in the Western Conference. Is that where you think this Kings team is? Do you think they're should be firmly in that top 6? Where do you think Sacramento is?
I think there's more of a chance of them being a play-in team than there is of being the 3 seed again. But I think more that 5 to 6 range. But again, I wouldn't be shocked to see them in that 7-8 range, because there are teams that didn't even get into the play-in who might be making some noise. Dallas might be in there. The Clippers might be better. The Suns going to be better than they were last season, probably. Where does Memphis fall? Do they fall down? The Lakers, they're probably not going to be a play-in team again. So I think that if they do end up as a play-in team, it shouldn't be like a gigantic failure, because there were so many unique circumstances in last year's Western Conference. But I think, I haven't actually done this and projected out my wins for everybody, but I think them as a 6 seed feels like a reasonable expectation.
Well, Josh, as we get close to the start of the season, of course, fantasy drafts really pick up too, and everybody can check out the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast for that. You're also doing previews of the season for every single team out there. Yep. Why don't you share a little bit about what people can expect on Locked On Fantasy Basketball? And what I always try and encourage when I bring up you and your show is, it's through the lens of fantasy basketball if you're into that, but there's also general NBA basketball discussion. So even if you're not necessarily the most avid fantasy basketball player, you'll still learn a lot and get that national coverage that you might be looking for.
Yeah, like I have to pay attention to all 30 teams and literally all 18 players on every roster. So I'm looking at everything from a pretty wide lens. And while we do talk a bit about the fantasy value of players, you're right, I'm discussing a lot of that from a real life perspective as well. And as you said, we're doing some team previews starting next week, which is not going to be particularly fantasy focused. It's mainly just going to be talking with the hosts of the team shows across the Locked On Network about their individual teams, and that'll start next week. And then we'll start sprinkling in some fantasy mock drafts and things like that over the coming weeks as we head into the beginning of the NBA season.
Big thank you to Josh again for joining me here on the Locked On Kings podcast. Thank you to you, as always, for tuning in. Can't wait to have you join me on the next episode of Locked On Kings. Until then, my name is Matt George. You've been listening to the Locked On Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.